This is the OnePlus 13, the flagship, the best they have to offer. It's not what we're talking about today. I'm more interested in how they went from this, whittled everything down, made compromises, and brought it down to this, the OnePlus 13R, a mid-ranger, $400 to $500. This is the one that's going to make it into people's pockets. And I'm wondering if OnePlus has made a deal breaker or a deal maker. Also, Happy New Year. And apparently we're doing phones this year. And a lot more. You'll see. Okay, step one, never ever make your customers feel like they've bought something cheap. And this is not cheap. OnePlus knows exactly what they're doing. We get a metal frame, we get a nice back, none of that rainbow plastic stuff, nothing garish, just a nice elegant back with these concentric circles etched in just to catch the light a little bit. And the screen is flat. I know you guys don't like rounded corners. Well, you don't get that. I don't think anyone is going to pick up this phone and say this is not a premium feeling device. I think they've knocked it out of the park, and that premium feeling continues on in when you use that display. We're talking 120 Hz, LTPO going all the way down to 1 Hz for that battery saving, more on that later, and 450 pixels per inch going up to a claimed brightness of approximately 1600 nits. This is bright enough for complete direct sunlight usage, and I love that. I wouldn't trust the 4500 or 5000 nit peak brightnesses that you're seeing on many phones these days. That's a lab conditions 0.1% window business. Realistically, 1600 nits, I believe it. This is really bright. Before we get any further, you should know that this is the full package. In the box, you get the phone at least, but you also get an 80-watt SuperVOOC charger. You get that iconic red cable that comes with OnePlus, and you get a case. And you get a SIM ejector tool for what it's worth. But nice case, very soft, and it's got a ribbed back for your gripping pleasure. Now, about that premium usage experience. Once you get it started, you've got Oxygen OS. This video is not about Oxygen OS, but I'll touch upon a few things. It is very smooth, it's very polished, and I like it. However, there are some gestures that are a bit finicky. For example, if you want to use one-handed mode, you've got to swipe up diagonally from one of the bottom corners. Problem is, swipe a little to the left and you open Google Gemini, swipe a little to the right and you open the app switcher. It is very, very finicky, and it's not the only one. There are multiple things that are as finicky in the operating system. So it could do with a little tweaking, and also there is a distinct remnant of 2012 here. There's a bunch of features that are just like, I get the customizations. Customizations are great, but who is changing the transition animation between home screens? Who's doing that? That is possibly even more obsolete than ringtones. And speaking of things that are vestiges of a decade ago, you get an IR blaster. Who is using an IR? Look, it's probably important. It's probably useful to some people out there. All I'm saying is, where's my headphone jack at? You could have. You know you could have. Also, you get a fingerprint scanner right at the bottom there. It's a little too low for a big phone like this. I feel like it should be higher up on the screen, but it's pretty quick, it's pretty responsive, and I got no issues using it. Now, Oxygen OS aside, let's get down to it. The whole shtick about this phone is that it has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. That's the entire thing. There's a bunch of other specs, of course, but you can read that on any website. The point is, you get a flagship processor that many people were willing to spend upwards of $800 just a few months ago, now sub $500, which is awesome if it performs. Complementing that, you've got the UFS 4.0, so no compromises there. However, it is USB 2.0, so if you shoot a lot of content like I do and you want to transfer it off, or you want video out, you're probably not going to get support for that, or the transferring files is going to be very slow. But how does it actually perform?
Alright, from a purely synthetic benchmarks perspective, I have to say single core scores were exactly where you'd expect it, but multi-core scores did fall short of what you would expect from an 8 Gen 3. In fact, it was more in line with an 8 Gen 2 device. And 2.2 scores were similarly falling short by about 10% of what you'd expect, coming in at 1.8 million as opposed to the 2.1, 2.2 million that you should expect for an 8 Gen 3. Now, as of the time of recording this video, I have been told that there is a software update that might improve performance of some sort, but there is no indication as of yet that it would improve these benchmarks per se.
For people who need computational power over extended periods of time, heavy workloads, if you run it for a long period of time, you may run into a little bit of thermal throttling. Now, I did the Wildlife Extreme Stress Test. It's a 20-minute stress test, and in that test I got a stability score of only 57%, which meant that at some point this did start thermal throttling, and sure enough, it does get warm.
Now you will notice that in this graph, the point at which it actually thermal throttles and the performance is lower happens quite far into the test, and at some point it actually bounces back to near original performance. So this may well be a software issue, and this may actually be sorted out with an update. In the real world, I did not feel that this was in any way a slow SoC or phone. Everything I threw at it was handled as expected, and unless you're subjecting this to very heavy workloads over a protracted amount of time, I suspect most people will not really feel any dip in performance.
The one place you might feel an issue is gaming. In the real world, PUBG Mobile, I tried it yesterday for a 45-minute gaming session and it gave me 120 frames per second flat, steady. No issues whatsoever. It didn't get too hot either. Same thing for Witherly Waves. What's that? I don't know. That new game. I tried it out, okay, for as long as I could bear playing it. And the graphics look great, and you get 120 frames per second. Now, that was on medium graphics, to be fair, but for most people in a screen this size, that's going to be plenty. Now, Call of Duty Warzone was a little bit different.
I'm not sure why, but I only got about 60 frames per second maximum for a couple of games. After that, the phone got really hot and frame rates in busy scenes dropped down to the low 40s and stayed there for a while. So I think Call of Duty Warzone doesn't quite work for maintained 60 frames per second, although it was still playable.
But in many other games, I suspect you're going to have a great gaming experience for reasonable gaming periods of time. I'm talking 40 minutes to an hour gaming session. If you're an avid gamer, then I think the cooling solution in this cannot keep up with the SoC's capability over longer periods of time. For most people, I don't think you're going to feel a performance loss at all. Which brings us to the one other thing people do with their phones most often. They take photos and videos. So, a bit of good news here. Compared to the Chinese version, the Ace 5, this one's got upgraded cameras. You get a 50 megapixel main sensor, you get a 50 megapixel telephoto, and that staple 8 megapixel ultra wide. I would give you sensor sizes, but they're basically almost exactly the same as every other sensor on every other phone. So it comes down to the optics and it comes down to the computation. Okay, so I took a bunch of photos and videos and I reviewed it on my MacBook Pro, calibrated screen, Delta E of maximum 1.3 with an average of less than 1. It's as good as it gets. Here's what I noticed. Daylight shots, honestly, pretty good. For a mid-range phone, this is working well. You get a reasonable amount of detail. HDR processing is pretty much where I'd want it to be. One minor point, and this is across the board, no matter what image you take, I found that in certain situations there's a warm tinge and a red hue, like a little magenta hue to your photos. But if there's fluorescent lighting, it tended to go towards the green a little. And this is odd. I get that this doesn't have the Hasselblad partnership involved, but this is something they can fix easily, and I hope they do going ahead, because otherwise the photos are pretty good. When you shift to night photography though, I would urge you not to use the ultra wide. That's where things really break down. Telephoto is not too bad, surprisingly, and this is surprising because mostly telephoto lenses on most cameras, most phone cameras, are just bad. They're just bad. Here also it's just not great, but this is a mid-ranger, and for a mid-range phone, the results are at the very least serviceable. Again, the main camera sensor is pretty darn good. Good highlight control, good exposure of shadows, and I have no real complaints except they need to lock down that color science a little. As a content creator, that is more doable. Like if there was a problem with the HDR processing, I would have a harder time working with the resulting photos and videos, but a color shift is something that you can do in post-processing. You can fix that. Now, it also has a portrait mode, as all cameras do now, and sometimes it was a bit hit and miss, but more often than not, I was actually quite impressed with the cutout. In fact, some cases, I thought it would completely miss, and then it does a little processing after you take the image, and then it's just really quite good. I also like the way the background blur sort of gradients from the foreground to the background like you would in a real camera. Now, when it comes to video, daylight was great. There's no issues with daylight video, except that if you're walking around with it, there is a fair bit of background jitter, and this is most evident when you're taking that video at night. I would urge you to use the main camera sensor at night. During the day, you can use the telephoto or the main camera sensor. It's fine. Ultra wide if you really need it. But at night, I would highly advise against using the ultra wide. There's no detail there. Same thing for the telephoto. Everything's a little watercolory, if you know what I mean. But again, main camera is pretty good. Highlight control is pretty on point. And as long as you're using still shots or even panning shots, you will get good video out of this day or night. You just don't want to run and gun with this. You don't want to walk with this, especially not at night. Alright, so this is the selfie camera. It'll only go up to 1080p 30 frames per second, unfortunately, but that's okay. A good 1080p is worth better than a bad 4K, am I right? So, how is it handling the highlights? I don't know. I've not tested this yet. And now quickly to a darker background. There's shadows on my face. I don't know. You tell me what the HDR performance is like, but ultimately we should check the stabilization. Okay, this one's not as stabilized, I can tell already, but you know, that's not bad. Not bad for a selfie camera.
Which means it's time to finally make that big value judgment. Is this a deal breaker or a deal maker?
But before that, we have to talk about battery life. Look, this comes with the new silicon carbon batteries, and I'm a big fan of this plane that decided to go up. Where was I? Right. I'm a big fan of these silicon carbon batteries because they allow the phone to be slimmer but still have greater capacity, and this is no difference. However, another plane. Really? 6,000 milliampere battery, silicon carbon battery, that new tech, which we've been waiting for literally a decade. It's here and it's awesome. Now, it is a downgrade from the 6,400 milliampere battery that you can find on the Chinese version of this phone. However, you do get those upgraded cameras. And it's been 48 hours since I charged this. 48 hours, it's still going, and I have 23%. Now, granted, the last 48 hours have been light usage. I've taken photos, I've taken videos, posted on social media, and watched a bunch of YouTube videos that perhaps I spent a little too much time on. But the fact that it's been 48 hours and I'm still at 23% is kind of nuts. With moderate usage, it'll still give you 2 days. It's giving me a little more than 2 days now. You'll get 2 days. And with heavy usage, the first day I got it, I ran benchmarks, I did everything, got a day and a half with heavy usage. That is awesome. That is awesome. I think we're finally getting that 2-day battery life that we like. And if you find yourself running out of battery, you've got that 80-watt SuperVOOC charger. We're talking 50% charge in 15 minutes flat, as long as you use the correct cable and the charger. That's a day's battery life out of 15 minutes of charge. I'm okay with this. I'm okay with this. I know you can get better. I know you can get more. I don't care. This is pretty good. Okay, so what do we have here? We've got a phone that looks and feels properly premium. We've got a nice screen and a decent set of speakers, if I'm being honest, for media consumption. You've got a Snapdragon chipset, which means you got that Bluetooth codec with it, but it's an 8 Gen 3, and I think most people in most usage will not be able to tell the difference between the Snapdragon 8 Elite and the 8 Gen 3, not for most people's use cases. So you basically got a flagship phone for under $500, and there are a few compromises. The USB-C 2.0 is a little bit of a compromise for me because I wanted to transfer files off quickly. Can't do that. I do appreciate the fact that they have upgraded those lenses, the telephoto lens, much better than the Chinese version, the Ace 5. This is better. It's not great, but it is better. I'm pleasantly surprised by the camera. I also like the way it does edge detection for portrait photos. Very big fan of that. And the selfie camera is not too bad. It's pretty serviceable if you ask me. Low light, a little bit of an issue. I do wish they fixed the EIS jitter though. That is a big problem. If you're a content creator, then that's a huge problem. But even if you're not, it's really not great. That apart though, I can't really find too many faults with this device. But it's not about what I think, it's about what you think. Would you actually pay good money for this? Tell me in the comments down below. Obviously, if you thought this review was useful, you know what to do. The buttons are down there. It helps with the algorithm. I don't need to tell you. I'll see you in the next one. Stay happy, stay peaceful, stay colorful. Namaste.